My name is Elise Moran, and I document solo survival expeditions with a focus on practical fieldcraft in remote parts of California. The footage I collect is used for both training reference and long-form video essays. I approach every trip with a strict itinerary, redundant safety checks, and a consistent discipline regarding equipment handling. I state this carefully because what happened during my Granite Hollow field shoot was not the result of negligence, improvisation, or a lapse in routine. Every variable was accounted for, and still, events occurred that I cannot reconcile with the conditions I observed. I arrived at Granite Hollow just after dawn. The cooling shadows still clung to the canyon as I hiked in with my pack, camera cases, and a small roll of solar film for charging. The air was cold but not sharp, carrying the faint scent of granite dust and pine sap. My plan for the day was simple: spend daylight hours demonstrating off-trail navigation between the rock corridors, test 2 new compact tripods, and record a segment about risk management in low-visibility terrain. Granite Hollow is one of those places where the terrain folds into itself. Narrow passages, sudden vertical walls, pockets of shade that make it feel like early evening even at noon. It's visually dramatic, but it demands awareness. The trail in took longer than expected because the granite shelves were damp from overnight condensation. I paused twice to check soil stability around a few boulders before committing to the route. The only sounds were the distant tapping of a woodpecker and the soft abrasion of loose gravel under my boots. No wind, no animals, no other hikers. I was the only registered permit holder entering that day. By mid-morning, I reached a natural alcove in the rock formation that formed a shallow overhang. I chose it as my filming base since the ground was level and the wall behind me could reflect additional light onto my frame. I set up my primary camera first, a mirrorless unit mounted on a carbon fiber tripod. The second camera, a chest-level action model, I kept clipped to my pack strap. After running a brief sound test, I spoke my introduction, outlining the purpose of the trip and the location's hazards. During filming, nothing seemed out of place. I recorded a 20-minute segment about traversing loose talus slopes and pivoted the tripod twice to show different angles of the terrain. Each time, the controls responded smoothly. The camera battery held steady at 93%. There was no automatic shutoff, no unexplained jolt, no physical interference of any kind. I emphasize this because what came later conflicts with every piece of sensory data I had while filming. Just before noon, I packed up to relocate deeper into the corridor system. Granite Hollow narrows the farther you go, and the walls compress enough to make sound behave oddly. Echoes return with strange timing, often bouncing in from a different angle than expected. But that day, everything was quiet, eerily so. No echo at all, even when I spoke aloud to test the acoustics. Sound simply died in the air. I assumed the humidity trapped between the stone surfaces was dampening it. I hiked another half-mile into the hollow and set up at a tall, slanted pillar of granite. I planned to record a short piece on maintaining balance on uneven stone. I positioned the tripod, tightened the head, and pressed the power button. The camera blinked to life. I moved in front of the lens to adjust framing. Then the camera shut off. No warning, no beep, no fading screen, just an immediate blackout. I walked back, tapped the power button again, and examined the battery readout. Still at 89%. No error messages. I reset the system and waited. Everything appeared normal. I pressed record. The tally light glowed red, steady and reliable. I stepped back into position. 5 seconds later, the camera stopped recording on its own. This time I heard the faint click of the shutter switch disengaging, like someone had lightly tapped the button. But I was standing 12 feet away. I pressed it again manually, waited for the mechanism to stabilize, and started recording once more. The red light blinked. I inhaled, preparing to speak. The camera panned 3 degrees to the left. It moved. The tripod legs didn't shift. There was no slip in the footing. The ground was solid. Only the head rotated, a small, precise adjustment, as if someone had placed their hand on it and nudged it gently. I froze in place, watching for further motion. None came. After 10 seconds, I approached the tripod. All fittings were still tight. The head mechanism wasn't loose. I tried to replicate the movement by tapping the leg with my boot, but the vibrations didn't carry through. The head remained rigid unless moved manually. I canceled recording for the moment and packed the camera away. I attributed the movement to settling equipment, even though I couldn't make sense of it. With the remaining daylight, I shifted focus to scouting the next shot location. I spent an hour walking narrow paths between the granite walls, checking for stable platforms and safer filming points. It wasn't until early afternoon, when I returned to the alcove to review the morning's footage, that everything became impossible to rationalize. The first recording looked normal: my introduction, the environmental overview, the discussion of talus hazards. The camera angle matched what I remembered. Nothing unusual. The second file began with me positioning the tripod near the granite pillar. Then the camera jolted slightly, as if someone had placed a hand on the grip. The motion was subtle, barely visible, but precise. I leaned closer to the tiny playback screen, thinking maybe the stabilizer was overcorrecting. Then I scrubbed ahead. At the 5-second mark of the third clip, something walked directly behind me. A figure, person, human height, human gait. The silhouette passed through the far left margin of the frame, behind my shoulder, at a distance of maybe 10 feet. I was in the shot. I was speaking. And behind me, someone moved along the rock wall with absolute clarity. I never heard footsteps. I never saw anyone approach. I never sensed movement, but the camera captured it. And in every clip after that, the figure appeared again, closer each time. The frame froze on the exact moment the silhouette passed behind me, its outline blurred slightly by distance and the camera's shallow depth of field. I replayed the 3-second motion again, and the shape remained unmistakably human. Shoulders, arms, a stride that matched an adult's. No distorted proportions, no tricks of shadow, nothing that could be chalked up to an optical illusion. It was a person, and I had been within arm's reach without hearing a single sound. The first instinct that hit me was procedural. Confirm safety, identify potential human presence, reassess risk level. I set the camera down carefully on my lap and scanned the alcove, slow and methodical. The terrain around me was still, the light unchanged. Nothing moved among the granite shelves. I listened for anything. A cough, boot scrape, rustling clothing, even breathing carried by the canyon walls. Silence. Total silence. The kind that feels dense, like it has weight. I stood and walked toward the path where the figure had appeared in the footage. The ground was compacted with coarse granitic sand, firm enough that any recent passage would leave some form of impression. A displaced stone, a smear of dust, a scuffed patch where someone pivoted. I crouched, inspecting it closely. Not a single track. No prints. No drag marks from shoes. Nothing. The rational part of my brain immediately proposed an explanation. Someone had been there earlier, perhaps heading out of the hollow while I was repositioning the tripod. The moment captured on video might have occurred minutes before I turned around, and I only noticed it during playback. That logic barely held, but it was something to grip while the unease grew in my chest. I played through more clips. There were 6 files total. In each, the figure was closer, usually in the background, but unmistakable. Once, I saw the top of a head passing briefly between 2 boulders. Another showed a shoulder and part of an arm just beyond the focal plane. In the last clip, only minutes before I powered the camera down, the figure was not behind me but off to the right, almost in my peripheral edge, close enough that a person should have been fully visible if I had turned my head. And yet I had seen nothing. I don't scare easily. Anyone who works off-trail learns that nerves waste energy, and energy is survival. Still, as I stood in that overhang watching the clips loop over and over, a heavy sensation settled deep in my stomach. Whoever was in the footage had never announced themselves. They didn't call out. They didn't wave. They didn't make any attempt to alert me to their presence. In backcountry etiquette, surprising someone that closely is dangerous and irresponsible. Even the most inexperienced hiker knows to make themselves known when approaching from behind. This wasn't someone making a mistake. This was intentional. I packed the cameras away, cinching the straps until the cases were tight against my pack. The sky overhead was shifting to a brighter tone, losing the midday sharpness as a faint haze drifted over the ridge. I took this as my cue to start moving. I decided on a new objective: exit the hollow, notify rangers if necessary, and review the footage again once I was in a safe location. My route in was straightforward. 2 narrow corridors, 1 exposed scramble, and a gradual rise toward the trailhead. I could clear it in under 2 hours if I kept a steady pace. I began retracing my steps. At first everything looked familiar. The angled rock pillars, the split boulder with the vertical seam, the small patch of dried moss marking a shaded corner. But 5 minutes in, I reached a fork I didn't remember. 2 nearly identical passageways branched off, one slightly wider, one with a rougher surface. I paused, checking my GPS. The screen showed minimal satellite lock from being deep within the rock channels, but the faint directional reading suggested my exit was to the left. I followed the left path. The walls here were closer together, narrowing into a tall vertical slit. The light dimmed as I walked, which wasn't unusual. Granite formations often create sudden pockets of shade, but something felt wrong. The air was cooler here, noticeably. Granite doesn't drop temperature like that without wind or moisture, and I felt neither. Still, I continued forward, scanning the stone walls for any graffiti, chisel marks, or trail signs left by climbers. Nothing. The rock was unblemished, untouched, like this corridor saw no foot traffic at all. 10 minutes later, the corridor ended at a sheer wall. No exit, no slope upward, just a closed stone face. I stood there, breathing slowly, replaying the trail in my mind. I had not taken a wrong turn earlier. The path should have curved toward the ridge. I reversed direction, retracing every step, counting my strides, scanning for the fork. When I reached it again, my chest tightened. There were 3 paths now, not 2. I froze, staring at the new third opening, narrow, shadowed, angled slightly upward. I couldn't remember it being there. I couldn't remember any deviation that would create a third split. Either I had been so distracted reviewing the footage that I misinterpreted the terrain, or something about the hollow was disorienting me more than I realized. I forced myself to breathe steadily, grounding my senses. Smooth granite wall to my right, slight draft from the left corridor, faint smell of pine sap from the direction I originally came. I used those cues to choose the path with the draft, assuming airflow indicated an exit or at least a larger chamber. I walked for another 5 minutes. At first, the draft grew stronger, which reassured me. Then the air changed direction. The breeze brushed past my left cheek even though the corridor hadn't curved. A cold weight pressed lightly down my spine, a physical sensation like someone exhaling behind me. I stopped walking, heart thudding, and listened. Still nothing. Still absolute silence. I tightened the straps on my pack and pushed forward until the corridor opened into a slightly wider space. Just enough to see where I was placing my feet. The ground here was smoother, polished by runoff or seasonal water flow. That's when I saw it. A fresh boot print. Not mine. Someone had walked ahead of me. Recently. The edges were crisp, not weathered. The pressure pattern suggested a moderate build. Not heavy, not light. A human footprint in a place where I had seen no one, heard no one, and where the terrain kept shifting every time I tried to orient myself. I lifted my head slowly, scanning the narrowing passage ahead. Someone was in Granite Hollow with me, and they wanted me to know it. The boot print held my attention longer than it should have. I studied the depth, the angle, the crispness of the heel. Someone had placed their weight there recently, within the hour, maybe less. My pulse thudded in my ears as I crouched beside it, measuring it mentally against my own. Slightly smaller, different tread pattern. The realization tightened something deep in my ribs. I wasn't alone, and whoever else was in Granite Hollow had been deliberately keeping themselves just out of sight. I straightened slowly, scanning the terrain ahead. The corridor funneled into a low pass between two angled slabs of stone, where the light dimmed enough that shadows pooled into each other. If someone wanted to watch me without being detected, they would choose a place like that. Narrow, obstructed, full cover. I hesitated only long enough to steady my breathing. Staying still wouldn't help. Neither would calling out. The conventional wisdom in the backcountry is simple. You don't startle strangers, and you don't announce yourself if doing so compromises your safety. Something in my instincts, something old and conditioned, told me not to shout into that dark channel. I moved forward, placing each step precisely, keeping my weight centered to avoid loose gravel noises. I've tracked wildlife for years, and I relied on that same discipline now, pretending I wasn't tracking a person. The air grew cooler as I passed under the stone outcrop. The temperature dropped noticeable on the exposed skin of my hands. That same sensation returned. The weight behind me, that phantom warmth of someone standing close. I resisted the urge to turn around. If someone was following me, looking back wouldn't tell me anything except how close they were willing to get. After 30 more steps, the corridor opened unexpectedly into a wider basin, an almost circular depression with tall walls rising on all sides. Not quite a bowl, not quite a clearing. A dead-end chamber created by fractured granite slabs leaning against each other like an unfinished puzzle. The moment I entered, the air stilled completely. The silence became absolute, thick enough that my own breathing seemed intrusive. I paused at the threshold, unwilling to step fully inside. The ground was bare, dusty in places, rocky in others, but undisturbed. No prints, no drag marks, nothing to explain why the person whose boot print I'd followed hadn't continued into the chamber. They had stopped short, or turned around, or hidden in one of the narrow crevices splintering off the basin. I backed up a single step, letting my heel touch the firmer ground behind me. Standing in open space felt wrong, too exposed. I scanned every crevice, every dark wedge between the granite slabs. No movement, no flash of color, but something tugged at my attention, the faintest suggestion of a shape above me. I lifted my gaze. On the rock face to my right, maybe 8 feet up, a darker patch interrupted the uniform granite. Not an animal, not a shadow cast by clouds. It was the faint outline of a person's upper body, shoulders, head, just far enough back that the rock masked their full silhouette. I blinked hard, but the shape didn't disappear. Someone was standing on a ledge, watching me. My throat tightened. I couldn't see details. No face, no clothing, but the outline held still in a way that made my skin prickle. A person balancing on that narrow ledge wouldn't be perfectly motionless. Yet this one was. And even though the distance wasn't great, the granite surface acted like insulation, muting any sound they should have made climbing up there. I forced myself to stay calm. Fear kills judgment, and judgment keeps you alive. I turned away from the basin as if I hadn't seen the shape at all, keeping my posture neutral. It was a calculated decision. If they thought I was unaware, they were less likely to rush me or block my exit. I kept my pace steady, not slow enough to indicate fear, not fast enough to provoke. When I reached the corridor again, the air moved slightly, just a light suggestion of airflow brushing past the back of my shoulders. It wasn't the direction I expected. The draft earlier had come from ahead, hinting at an exit. Now it came behind me, pushing lightly toward the chamber I just left, as if urging me back. Granite formations don't reverse airflow unless there's a rapid temperature shift or a change in elevation. Neither had occurred. I didn't turn around. Instead, I followed the corridor back to the fork, the place where 3 paths had inexplicably appeared earlier. I kept moving until I reached it, counting my strides exactly, refusing to let the disorientation take hold again. When I arrived, my stomach dropped. There were 4 paths now. 4. And none of them looked identical to the ones I had taken earlier. The walls had shifted subtly, or maybe my perception had. Either way, nothing aligned with my memory. The corridor I'd originally entered from now looked narrower, with a sharper angle. The one with the draft was now almost completely dim. Another appeared newly carved, smoother than the others, as if shaped by water long ago. Granite Hollow wasn't supernatural. It wasn't alive. It wasn't conscious. I repeated that in my mind like a mantra. These formations don't move. They don't morph. They don't create new passageways in a matter of minutes. The only explanation was that I was losing spatial orientation, something that can happen when adrenaline spikes, when visual cues repeat, when fatigue sets in. But I wasn't fatigued. I wasn't dehydrated. I wasn't panicked. Not yet. Then I noticed something on the ground near the second corridor on the right. A footprint. My footprint. I recognized the exact tread pattern from my left boot. Same diagonal line through the heel rubber. Same slight flattening near the ball where I had put more pressure descending earlier. The print was facing inward toward the passage, not outward. As if I had walked into that corridor recently. Except I hadn't. I knelt, studying it closely. The dust displacement was fresh. No settling, no insect tracks across it. The print had been made maybe 15 minutes earlier at most. And yet I had no memory of stepping there. None. A faint vibration traveled through the ground then. A soft tremor, like the subtle shudder of a distant branch falling somewhere high above. Granite doesn't carry vibrations lightly, so the source couldn't have been far. I stood slowly, adjusting my pack, forcing my breath to stay even. There was no denying it anymore. Someone else was moving through Granite Hollow with precision, staying just beyond line of sight, stepping where I stepped, watching where I lost orientation. And now they were close enough that the ground itself reacted when they moved. The vibration faded almost as quickly as it came, leaving a tight, aching pressure in my chest. I stood perfectly still, listening. Granite doesn't lie. When it carries a tremor, something nearby is moving with enough weight or momentum to make the stone respond. But the air settled back into its oppressive quiet, as if the entire hollow had gone rigid, waiting. I needed to choose a path. Staying in one place was the easiest way to become predictable, and predictable people get cornered. I took one slow breath, tightening my grip on the strap of my pack, and turned toward the corridor marked by my own boot print. If I had stepped there earlier, even unintentionally, then that path at least held some trace of familiarity. And I needed anything familiar, anything to anchor my sense of direction. The corridor was narrower than the others, sloping gently upward. The walls curved inward, framing the sky above in a thin strip of muted light. I kept my pace deliberate, checking the ground every few steps for more prints, either mine or someone else's. Nothing. The dust was undisturbed besides the single print at the entrance. The temperature dipped again, no wind, no reason. Just an abrupt coolness filling the space like a slow, invisible tide. The silence pressed harder on my ears, the kind that makes your heartbeat seem unnaturally loud. I reached up instinctively to rub the side of my neck, grounding myself. Another 20 yards and the path widened. Only slightly, but enough for me to lower my guard a fraction. The terrain here was more broken. Fractured shelves, scattered rocks, narrow pockets where runoff had carved shallow pools in wetter seasons. If someone had come through, I expected to see some sign. A displaced pebble, a scrape of rubber, even a hair snagged on rough stone. But there was nothing. The emptiness was more unnerving than footprints would have been. Whoever was out here, they moved without leaving a single trace. I checked my watch. Afternoon, but not yet late. The light filtering down was still bright enough to navigate by, though shadows were lengthening. I had hours of daylight left, but instinct whispered that I didn't want to be in Granite Hollow for even 1 minute after sunset. I stepped carefully between two leaning slabs that formed a tight V-shaped gateway. On the far side, the canyon opened into a broader ravine lined with jagged outcrops and patches of pale lichen. I recognized this place. Relief warmed my chest. I had passed through here in the morning. It wasn't the exact center of Granite Hollow, but it was an anchor point, a landmark I remembered cataloging verbally on camera. The broken pillar near the left wall split into 3 vertical fragments. The slanted rock shelf where I demonstrated weight distribution. The shallow gully leading upward toward the main ridge. I had found my way back. I adjusted my pack and moved toward the sloped gully, careful not to slip on loose granitic sand. Each step brought me closer to open sky, to the ridge, to the trailhead. Once I reached higher ground, the terrain would normalize again. Granite Hollow's confusing echo patterns and visual symmetry couldn't disorient me from there. 5 steps, 10, 15, and then I stopped dead. Someone was standing at the top of the slope. Not a silhouette between rocks. Not a half-seen shape on a ledge. Person, full height, motionless, framed against the pale granite like they had been waiting. They were too far for me to see facial features clearly, but I could make out their posture. Upright, relaxed, arms at their sides. Not threatening, not overtly aggressive, just still, watching. My mouth went dry. This was the first direct sighting. The first time the figure stepped out of the half-hidden margins where they'd been drifting all day. I forced myself not to freeze. Panic is loud. Panic broadcasts vulnerability. Instead, I shifted my weight subtly, distributing it evenly, keeping my stance ready to move in any direction. My voice stayed low, calm, professional. "Hello," I said, projecting just enough to be heard without shouting. "I didn't realize anyone else was down here. Are you all right?" The figure didn't answer, didn't wave, didn't shift their weight, didn't even appear to breathe. I waited 3 seconds, then 5, then 10. Nothing. The situation escalated from uneasy to unsafe. In remote wilderness, silence is rarely neutral. I needed information, distance, movement, intent, but their stillness gave me none. I took a step backward, only one, slow and controlled. The figure tilted their head. A small movement, but one I saw clearly even from 50 yards away. A deliberate tilt, as if assessing me from a new angle. That was enough. I pivoted slightly to my left, lining myself up with a secondary route along the ravine wall. It wasn't the main exit, but it could bring me back toward my morning path. I didn't break into a run. Running triggers pursuit. Instead, I walked, fast, steady, purposeful. The slope angled upward sharply, forcing me to use my hands to balance. As I climbed, I kept glancing back every few steps. On the third glance, the figure was gone. Not walked away, not ducked behind a rock, just gone. A space that had been occupied seconds earlier now stood empty. My heart hammered so hard the sound filled my head. Adrenaline sharpened everything. The scrape of my boots, the rustle of my pack straps, the roughness of the stone under my palms. I reached the top of the smaller ridge and crouched low behind a natural granite lip. I scanned the basin below. No movement, no figure, no sound of footsteps or shifting gravel. Whoever they were, they either moved with impossible quietness, or they hadn't moved at all, and my angle had simply erased them from sight. I didn't like either explanation. I slid down the opposite side, careful not to dislodge anything that would give away my position. At the base, the terrain leveled out into a narrow corridor leading back toward the outer channel of the hollow. I recognized the sharp bend in the wall, the faint discoloration where mineral deposits had stained the stone. I was close, less than 20 minutes from the exit. Then I noticed something on the ground directly in the center of the corridor. A footprint, fresh, but not mine, and not the same tread pattern as the one earlier. Someone else was here too. The new footprint stopped me mid-step. Different tread, wider spacing between the lugs, a deeper heel mark like the person weighed more or carried a heavier load. My breath tightened as I crouched over it. The dust displacement was fresh, so fresh it hadn't even settled into the fine cracks of the granite surface. Whoever made it had walked through here within minutes, maybe less. 2 people in granite hollow, or 1 person switching shoes, which made less sense but didn't feel any less possible in the moment. I tried to focus on the details, the angle of the print, the direction of the gate. It pointed straight down the corridor, toward the direction I needed to go to get out. That fact alone told me something else. They were ahead of me, not behind. I straightened slowly and listened. Nothing. Not a scrape. Not a shift. Not a breath. I forced my brain into fieldwork mode. Assess, don't imagine. Calculate, don't interpret. The print meant someone came this way. The silence meant they were no longer within immediate range. That was all I could verify. The corridor ahead was narrow and straight, flanked on both sides by granite walls that rose steeply toward the sky. I stepped forward cautiously, testing each placement, sweeping my eyes along the walls, the ground, the angles where someone could be waiting. The air remained unnaturally cold, as if sunlight couldn't penetrate the passage regardless of how bright the sky was overhead. As I walked, more prints appeared, sporadic at first, then more consistent. Every few steps, another one. The pattern made no sense. At some points, the prints overlapped each other like the person had paused and shifted weight. Other times, they zigzagged slightly, as if the person adjusted their route to stay within certain shadows. I followed them for almost 5 minutes. Then they stopped. Just stopped. Right at the mouth of a wider channel that I recognized as part of the main hollow. The prints ended abruptly with no directional fade, no scuff marks indicating a turn, no signs of backtracking. Someone couldn't just vanish from a trail of dust that crisp, unless they stepped onto stone that wouldn't hold prints, which is exactly what lay ahead. A series of large, smooth granite slabs. My instincts screamed to turn around, but there was no safer option. Going back meant retracing a path I no longer trusted. Going forward meant choosing the route with at least a known landmark up ahead. I could see the faint notch in the ridge from where the morning light had poured in. If I could reach that opening, the canyon would widen, and the terrain would stop acting like a maze. I stepped onto the first slab. The surface was cool, slightly slick in that polished way granite gets from years of water flow. I kept my center of gravity low and moved from slab to slab, testing each with the ball of my foot before shifting my weight. 3 slabs in, I froze. A shadow moved across the far wall. Not the kind cast by clouds overhead. This was sharper, more defined. A silhouette moving from left to right across a vertical plane of granite 20 yards ahead. My pulse spiked so hard I felt it in my fingertips. I tightened every muscle in my legs to stay still. Shadows don't slide sideways like that unless something physical moves through the light source. The shadow paused, stretched slightly, then contracted, like someone shifting their stance. It wasn't an illusion. Someone was standing between me and the exit ridge. I shifted my weight silently and crouched behind a low rock shelf. My breathing stayed controlled, measured, but the pressure in my chest felt like someone was squeezing my ribs from the inside. I waited for the shadow to move again. After 10 seconds, it did, back toward the left, deliberately slow. They were pacing, blocking the exit. I didn't know if they knew I was watching. I didn't know if they were waiting for me specifically, but they were there, and that meant I couldn't walk straight into the open. I scanned the surrounding stone for alternatives. A narrow chute angled up along the right wall, steeper, but climbable if I used both hands and committed. It would lead to the same ridge but approach from above instead of below. The slope ended in a natural depression where I could stay low and unseen until I figured out where the shadow's owner actually was. I made the decision. Fast decisions keep you alive. Indecision gets you cornered. I moved. Low. Quiet. Fast enough to cover distance but slow enough to avoid any loose gravel. The first part of the incline was manageable, a steady rise with solid footing. Halfway up, the incline steepened, forcing me to plant my palms on the stone for leverage. The surface bit into my skin, cool and gritty. When I reached the depression near the top, I flattened myself behind the granite lip and dared a slow look. The shadow was gone from the far wall. I scanned every angle I could see. No figure, no outline, no movement. I strained to hear anything. Footsteps, breathing, stones scraping under weight. But the hollow remained unbearably silent. A kind of silence that made my hearing feel defective. I had maybe 30 seconds before I had to move again. Staying still too long was as dangerous as moving too fast. I crawled up the last stretch, using my elbows to anchor myself, and reached the ridge. Then I stopped cold. 40 yards below me, directly in the place where I had been standing minutes earlier, someone was walking across the slabs. Same gait as the figure in my footage. Same steady, unhurried pace. Same posture, upright, hands loose at their sides. But they weren't following my route. They were tracing the exact steps I had taken, pausing where I had paused, adjusting direction where I had adjusted. A perfect shadow of my path, delayed by only a short margin. And then the figure did something that made every breath shake in my throat. They looked up, not in a vague sweeping glance, directly. Me. Their chin tilted, their head aligned, their posture sharpened with sudden clarity. They knew where I was. They had always known. The moment their face angled upward, I felt a jolt, clean, electric, instinctive. I ducked behind the granite lip so fast my shoulder scraped the rock. Pain flared, sharp and grounding, but I didn't dare breathe too loudly. My entire body locked in place. I waited, counting my heartbeat in slow, controlled intervals. 5 seconds, 10, 15. No footsteps on stone. No shift in the gravel below. No signs of climbing. But I didn't move. The worst mistake would be assuming they hadn't seen me clearly. That look wasn't accidental. It was precise, intentional. They watched me move up the chute and followed my exact route through the hollow. They knew how to track. They knew how to stay hidden. And they weren't afraid of being seen anymore. I pressed my cheek against the granite, grounding myself, forcing my thoughts into order. There was one rule drilled into my fieldwork training. You don't outrun people, you outsmart terrain. And this ridge was my advantage. It offered cover, angles to hide movement, and a narrow traverse that led to an elevated path toward the exit of Granite Hollow. I stayed low and crawled sideways along the ridge's backside where the stone dipped just enough to shield me from the open view. My right knee dragged against rough granite, but I pushed forward, inch by inch. When I reached a slight bend, I allowed myself a brief glance back toward the basin. The slabs below were empty. The figure was gone. A cold shiver crawled down my spine. I scanned deeper into the hollow, tracing the channels, the shaded pockets where someone could hide. Nothing. Not a shadow. Not a flicker. It was as if the hollow had swallowed them whole. I backed away from the edge. Being watched is one kind of danger. Losing sight of the watcher is worse. I kept moving along the ridge, maintaining low cover. The elevation gave me a small but meaningful advantage. I could see the upper edges of the hollow stretching toward the brighter sky beyond the exit corridor. The daylight had taken on a late afternoon quality, slightly warmer, slightly slanted. I still had time, but not much. Once the sun dropped behind the granite walls, everything would turn cold faster than expected, and the shadows would blend into a uniform darkness. I needed to reach the exit before that happened. Another 5 minutes of careful movement brought me to a point where the ridge sloped downward in a gradual incline. It wasn't the main trail, but it would intersect with it eventually. I recognized a faint line of flattened vegetation near the base, minimal, but consistent with the natural drainage route I had crossed earlier that morning. Path. A real one. I shifted my weight to begin the descent. Then I froze again. On the slab directly below the ridge, not 10 feet from where I intended to step down, lay something that hadn't been there earlier. My secondary camera. The smaller action unit I kept clipped to my pack. It sat upright, facing the ridge, as if someone had placed it there intentionally. My blood ran cold. I reached back to check my strap, fingers fumbling over the plastic clip. The mount was empty. The camera was gone from my pack without me noticing. Either it fell, and I should have heard it, felt it, something, or someone removed it. The camera's front lens ring gleamed faintly in the afternoon light, pointed straight at where I stood. A trap, a signal, a message. I forced myself to swallow and steady my hands. Leaving the camera wasn't an option. It contained footage I needed to understand whatever was happening. But approaching it without thinking would be reckless. I scanned the area around the slab first. No footprints, no disturbed dust, no sign of someone lingering. Still, my instincts screamed caution. I slid down the ridge slowly, choosing a diagonal route that kept my body angled sideways in case I needed to drop quickly. My boots hit the slab with a muted thud. I crouched immediately, reaching for the camera with 2 fingertips before pulling it toward me. The casing was cold, much colder than the surrounding rock. I pressed the playback button, half dreading what I'd see. A video file appeared, time-stamped 30 minutes ago. I felt my breath hitch. I pressed play. The screen showed my own back, recorded from behind. I watched myself walking through the corridor where I had discovered the second set of footprints. The figure holding the camera, whoever they were, stayed at a steady distance, tracking me with practiced ease. The angle didn't wobble. The frame didn't shake. It was deliberate, controlled, as if filmed by someone who knew exactly how to stabilize handheld shots. The video continued for nearly a full minute. I watched myself kneel to examine a footprint, one I now realized belonged to the same person filming me. Then the camera shifted, slightly, revealing a sliver of the filmer's shadow cast along the wall. Not a tall shadow, not malformed, just a human silhouette. I paused the video and squinted at the outline. Shoulders, head, no details. I scrubbed forward. At the 50-second mark, the footage jerked suddenly, like the camera holder had snapped it upward by surprise. The frame stabilized and centered squarely on my head as I stood, unaware. Then the video cut off. An abrupt end. No shutdown. No lowering of the camera. Just a hard stop. I checked the timestamp again. 30 minutes. That meant this footage was recorded at the same time I was climbing the chute and hiding behind the granite lip. They were behind me then, tracking me even as I tried to evade them. The idea pressed on my chest like a weight. They were close the entire time. I slid the camera into my jacket pocket, securing it tightly, and forced myself to breathe evenly. Panic distorts sound, narrows vision, makes you miss things. I needed every sense sharp and functioning. I moved toward the drainage path. The ground here sloped gently, scattered with grit and loose fragments. I kept my steps light, avoiding anything that might echo. My ears strained against the silence. Granite Hollow had been quiet all day, but this was different. This was anticipation. The air felt like it was waiting for something to happen. Halfway down the slope, a faint crack echoed behind me. Stone shifting, foot on gravel. I whipped around. Nothing was there, but the sound had been close. Too close. Whoever was in Granite Hollow with me was no longer content to keep distance. They were closing in, and they knew I was heading for the exit. The sound lingered in my ears long after it faded. Sharp, undeniable. Too heavy to be an animal and too controlled to be an accident. I kept my body angled toward the drainage path, but my eyes stayed locked on the ridge behind me. Nothing moved. The granite was empty, still, indifferent. But the silence felt different now. It wasn't absence. It was presence, tightly coiled and concealed. I adjusted my breathing, slow and steady, and forced my attention forward. The exit ridge wasn't far. I could see a faint change in the color of the sky where the canyon mouth widened. If I kept a deliberate pace, I could reach it within 10 minutes. Less if I didn't let the terrain slow me. The slope curved slightly as it descended, and the granite walls widened enough for sunlight to spill in. It should have felt reassuring. Instead, the openness made every sound feel amplified. My own footsteps, the shifting of my pack straps, even the dull thump of my heartbeat in my ears. Halfway down, the ground leveled into a shallow basin littered with fist-sized rocks. I remembered stepping through this area in the morning. I'd filmed a short piece about choosing stable footing on uneven surfaces. The memory anchored me for a moment, until I noticed something that hadn't been there earlier. A jacket, folded neatly, placed on a flat stone directly in the center of the basin. I felt a cold, hollow tightening in my gut. The jacket was an outdoor shell, black, lightweight, the kind used for wind protection. It wasn't mine. I approached cautiously, circling around it with slow, measured steps. No footprints around it. No scuff marks. No sign of how it got there. I crouched and studied the fabric. It was clean. No dirt on the sleeves. No pine needles stuck to the shoulders. No debris caught in the zipper, like it had been kept in a pack, or worn recently. I reached out and pressed the back of my hand against the sleeve. Warm. Not warm from sunlight. The basin had been shaded all afternoon. Warm from body heat. Someone had worn it minutes ago, maybe less. My pulse hammered against my ribcage. The placement wasn't random. It wasn't dropped. It was set there on purpose. Presented. Displayed. As if to say, I'm close enough to leave this without you hearing me. I rose slowly and backed away. A new awareness hung around me, subtle and electric. I wasn't being stalked now. I was being herded. The basin had only 2 exits, the way I came, and the path leading closer to the main canyon mouth. The jacket sat directly on the line between the two. If I circled around it, the unseen watcher would know exactly which route I chose. I opted for the one leading outward. The ridge was too close to ignore. I needed daylight. I needed distance. And I needed other hikers, rangers, or anyone who could corroborate what I had seen. I stepped carefully around the jacket and continued forward. 5 steps. 10. A faint crunch behind me. I spun around instantly. Nothing. Just the basin, the jacket, the rocks. But the sound had been crisp, like a boot sole compressing loose grit. The realization tightened every muscle in my body. They were moving when I moved, stopping when I stopped, matching my rhythm, staying just out of sight but close enough to listen to the smallest shift of stone beneath my boots. I forced myself to turn away and continue, not increasing speed, not yet. Running would guarantee pursuit. Slow, steady movement kept me controlled and harder to predict. That was the only advantage I had. The corridor ahead narrowed again. The light concentrated into a long vertical strip as the granite leaned inward. I recognized the formation, 2 tall slabs that acted like a natural portal. Beyond them, the canyon floor widened and the slope curved upward toward the official trail. That was it, the exit. 30 more yards and I'd be out of the hollow. My chest tightened with cautious hope. I stepped through the granite portal and stopped cold. Someone stood in the middle of the passage ahead. Not the figure from earlier. This person was wearing the black jacket I'd just seen folded in the basin. They faced away from me, standing perfectly still, arms at their sides. Their head was tilted slightly to the left, as if listening to something on the wind that I couldn't hear. There was no way they could have passed me. I'd been watching the corridor. I'd seen every angle. No one had walked through. No one could have bypassed me unseen, which meant they were already ahead of me, waiting. My heartbeat hit my throat. I took one silent step backward into the shadows of the portal. The figure did not turn, did not shift, did not move, just stood there, facing the exit as if blocking the way, as if guarding it. I weighed my options quickly. The granite walls on either side were too smooth to climb without proper friction gear. The corridor was too narrow to slip past them without brushing their arm. And approaching head-on could provoke the worst reaction. I scanned for alternate routes. A narrow fissure ran along the right-hand wall, wide enough for my body if I angled sideways. It wasn't part of the trail, but it might lead to the slope above the exit. I could bypass the figure entirely if I moved quietly enough. I backed up another step, slow, careful. Pebble rolled under my boot. The figure's head snapped toward me instantly. Not the full body, just the head. A sharp, precise turn. The kind that isn't reflexive but deliberate. Their face remained obscured by distance and lighting, but the movement itself hit me like a spike of cold adrenaline. I didn't think. I moved, sliding into the fissure, twisting sideways, using my hands to brace against the rock. The granite scraped my skin, catching on my jacket sleeves. The space tightened around my chest, compressing the breath in my lungs. I pushed through anyway, inch by inch, forcing my body into the narrowing crevice. Behind me, I heard a sound that made my skin crawl. Footsteps, fast ones, approaching. I shoved forward harder, ignoring the gouges of stone against my arms. The crevice widened slightly after 10 feet, opening into a slanted channel leading upward. I climbed, fingers gripping tiny holds, boots scraping desperately for purchase. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Then, a hand slapped the granite inches behind my ankle. Fingers dragged across the stone, searching, reaching. I lunged upward, pulling myself over the lip of the channel with every ounce of strength I had left. The last burst of daylight hit my face as I rolled onto a flat slab overlooking the canyon mouth. I scrambled to my feet, breath heaving, heart pounding. Below me, the crevice yawned dark and empty. The hand was gone. No movement. No sound. But I wasn't safe yet. I was out of Granite Hollow's inner maze, but not out of the hollow itself. And somewhere below, the person in the black jacket was climbing after me. I stayed crouched on the slab for several seconds, muscles trembling from the climb, lungs straining to pull steady breaths. The slab extended outward like a balcony, suspended above the outer edge of Granite Hollow. Daylight spilled across the stone in wide angles now, warmer but beginning to soften toward evening. I wasn't out yet, but for the first time in hours the terrain felt slightly more predictable, less like an enclosed maze and more like an actual canyon. I forced myself to stay low and listen. First, nothing. Then, faintly, from the crevice below, the dry scrape of fabric against stone. Slow, controlled, not frantic climbing, methodical. Someone was taking their time, climbing deliberately, like they knew I wouldn't get far. I backed away from the crevice edge, careful not to dislodge anything that would announce my movements. The slab led into a narrow ledge that hugged the outer canyon wall. Narrow but passable. I traced it with my eyes, confirming its stability, the way it curved around the rock face before merging with sloped terrain further ahead. I had a plan. Stay silent, stay low, create distance, reach the official trail. I began moving. Each step on the ledge required precision. The granite surface angled downward slightly, and any misstep would send gravel skittering into the cavern below. I kept one hand against the canyon wall for balance, fingers brushing rough stone, anchoring my nerves. After 15 careful feet, the ledge widened enough that I could straighten my posture. I risked a glance behind me. The crevice remained dark, the opening still and quiet, but I knew they were climbing. I felt it uncomfortably deep inside my chest. An instinct, a pressure, like the canyon itself was inhaling. The air carried the faintest tremor again, subtle but unmistakable. The same vibration I'd felt earlier transmitted through the granite. They were moving. I pushed forward faster, keeping my steps controlled but urgent. The ledge reconnected with a natural slope of broken rock that fanned out like a ramp toward the outer mouth of the hollow. I recognized the pattern of mineral streaks, rust-red iron staining vertical drips across pale stone. I had seen these in the morning. I was close. I hurried across the broken stones, boots crunching, breath steadying with each step. Then I saw something ahead. A trail marker. A small, simple wooden post hammered into the ground near the edge of the ridge. The official route. The real one. The one that led back to the trailhead. Relief washed over me so sharply my knees almost buckled. Quickened my pace. 20 yards. 15. 10. A crack echoed behind me. Louder this time. I spun around, chest tight. Someone stood on the slab I had climbed from. Not the one in the black jacket. This person was wearing a different layer. A brown long-sleeved shirt. Dark pants. Their build was broader, weight distributed evenly across their stance. They stood perfectly still, facing me, watching with an unhurried calm that twisted my stomach into knots. 2 people. There were 2. Not imagined. Not illusions. 2 separate individuals, both tracking me through the hollow, both appearing ahead of me at impossible intervals. The second figure did not move, did not speak, did not approach. They simply stared, as though waiting for something. My mind raced through possibilities. Hikers? Rangers? Locals? None aligned with the behavior. None explained the silent pursuit, the shadowing, the camera taken from my pack, the perfectly placed jacket. None explained them appearing in places they could not have reached in time. I turned and sprinted the final steps to the ridge marker. This time I allowed myself to run. The trail sloped upward sharply, gravel shifting under my boots. I used my hands when necessary, pushing off rock, ignoring the burn in my legs. All that mattered was distance, getting as far from Granite Hollow as possible. The ridge crest rose ahead. I climbed the last few feet and pulled myself onto the trail. The wind hit me immediately, cool, steady, honest. Carried the smell of pine and dry earth. Real terrain, real world. The boundary between the hollow and everything else felt tangible. I didn't stop moving. I followed the trail along the ridge, knowing the parking area was still over a mile away, but at least on a direct route. The sun had begun its descent, casting long golden threads across the landscape. My shadow stretched ahead of me on the dirt path. 200 yards down the trail, I slowed only because something caught my attention. A shape far behind me on the ridge. I turned. A figure stood on the crest of the trail where I just climbed up. The brown-sleeved one. They hadn't chased me. They hadn't tried to cut me off. They stood still, just watching, letting me see how close they'd come. Then, unervingly, they lifted an arm. For a moment, my heart seized. But they didn't wave. They pointed, their hand leveled directly to their right, toward the valley slope beside the trail. Confused, I followed the line of their arm with my eyes, and saw movement. A second figure was climbing the slope fast, weaving between scattered scrub and loose stone, heading upward with precision that didn't look like rushing or stumbling. Their movements were smooth, purposeful, almost practiced. The black-jacketed person. They weren't chasing me along the trail. They were cutting me off ahead. My body reacted before thought could catch up. I turned and ran again, pushing my legs harder than I had all day. The trail wound through exposed rock, tightening into switchbacks I recognized from the morning. The wind gusted from the west, steady now, carrying the faint roar of distant highway noise. Life, civilization. I tore around a bend in the trail and saw the narrow section ahead where it crossed a natural bridge of compacted granite. A choke point. If someone wanted to intercept me, they'd choose that spot. I slowed, listening. Nothing. The bridge lay empty. I moved forward cautiously, keeping my center low, scanning above and below the trail. Halfway across, I saw it, another footprint. Fresh, in the middle of the bridge. I didn't stop. Couldn't. I kept moving, heart pounding so loud it drowned out everything else. I crossed the bridge, sprinted up the next incline, and didn't look back until I reached the wider bend where the trail flattened out. When I did look back, both figures stood on the bridge, side by side, unmoving, watching. They had reached it in seconds, or they had already been there. Either explanation was terrifying. I turned and ran harder. The parking lot was close. I could feel it. I just needed to reach it. The trail curved sharply around a bank of low brush and granite shelves, and my lungs felt like they were scraping the inside of my ribs. I forced myself not to look back again. Every instinct screamed to check how close they were, but looking back slows you down. My training had drilled that into me. Forward. Eyes forward. One step ahead at a time. The trail broadened as the ridge leveled, and for the first time all day I could see the sky unobstructed. The sun hung low, an orange disk sinking behind western peaks. I still had light, maybe 40 minutes at most, but the growing shadows along the trail stretched long and thin like reaching fingers. The parking area had to be less than half a mile now. I could almost picture the gravel lot, the wooden sign, the informational kiosk I'd passed before sunrise. I kept running. My boots pounded the hard-packed dirt, each impact jarring up my shins. My shoulder throbbed from the earlier scrape. My legs burned from the climb, but adrenaline shoved all discomfort aside. Every sound felt amplified. The rasp of my breath, the slap of my soles, the subtle rattle of gear inside my pack. I couldn't tell if the footsteps behind me were real or imagined. The wind distorted everything. When the trail dipped slightly, bending around another outcrop, I allowed myself a single glance back. No one was there. The ridge was empty, but that meant nothing. Both of them had appeared suddenly, silently, repeatedly. They didn't need to be visible to be close. They didn't need to chase. They just needed to stay near enough to cut me off when it mattered. I pushed harder. The trail straightened into a long stretch where scrub gave way to open granite. I recognized this area, the same place where I'd paused that morning to check my pack straps and take a quick water break. The terrain held steady, predictable, honest. The sound of distant highway noise grew faint but real. Civilization, people, phones, radios, witnesses. I crested the rise. And then I saw it. The parking lot. The tiny cluster of vehicles parked beneath a line of pines. My own car, a white SUV, sat on the far right, angled slightly toward the road. Relief hit so hard I almost stumbled. I felt the urge to cry purely from the pressure of it, but I couldn't waste time. Crying slowed breathing, and I needed every breath I could take. I ran the last stretch, the trail widening into the gravel approach. My boots hit loose stones, sliding slightly, but I didn't care. I sprinted toward my SUV, hands fumbling for my keys in my jacket pocket. Something shifted to my left. I froze mid-stride. A person stood at the edge of the parking lot, near the tree line. Not one of the two I'd seen earlier. This figure was smaller, younger, maybe mid-30s, wearing a faded gray hoodie. At first glance, they looked like any hiker arriving late in the day. They didn't move, didn't react, just stood, half-shrouded by shadows. For a heartbeat, I thought they might be a normal visitor. But then they turned their head toward me. Not the whole body, just the head. A sharp, precise movement. My breath seized. It was the same movement the black-jacketed figure had made. The same unnatural stillness surrounding the posture. The same watching. 3 people. My hands tightened around my keys. I kept my pace slow, measured, moving sideways toward my car without taking my eyes off the figure by the trees. I scanned the rest of the lot, heart hammering. Empty. Silent. No rangers. No other hikers. No one within shouting distance. I took another step toward my SUV. Then another. The figure by the trees did not move. But something in their stance shifted. Something subtle, like tension coiling in their legs. A single thought sliced through my panic. They're waiting for me to get closer. I changed direction instantly, veering hard toward the driver's side door. I hit the key fob, the lights blinked, the lock clicked open. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the stillness. The hooded figure stepped forward. One step. Smooth. Deliberate. I yanked the door open and threw myself inside, slamming it shut with all my strength. I hit the lock button 3 times out of instinct. My hands shook as I jammed the key into the ignition, the engine coughing awake in a stuttering growl. The figure was no longer by the trees. My heart jumped violently. I scanned the lot. There, standing at the edge of the gravel just yards away, facing my car head-on. There was no way they'd crossed that distance so fast. I threw the SUV into reverse, engine straining as the tires rolled over gravel. The figure didn't flinch, didn't follow, didn't react at all. They just watched as I backed away, eyes locked on mine through the windshield. When I shifted into drive, I hesitated only long enough to make sure no one was behind me. Then I pressed the accelerator. The SUV lurched forward. As I pulled onto the access road, I checked the rearview mirror, half dreading what I'd see. The figure was still standing there, but they weren't alone. The 2 from the bridge, the brown-sleeved one and the black-jacketed one, had emerged from opposite sides of the lot. They stood beside the hooded figure, perfectly spaced, perfectly still, watching as my SUV rolled farther away. I didn't stop looking until the road curved and the lot disappeared from view. Even then, I checked the mirror 3 more times before I reached the highway. The entire drive back into town, I kept glancing into the rearview mirror, expecting to see their silhouettes in every approaching car, every passing figure on the shoulder, every reflection in roadside signs. They never appeared, but the fear didn't fade, settled deeper, because later, when I reviewed the secondary camera footage on my laptop, I noticed something I hadn't seen in the moment. At the very end of the file, after the frame cut off, a final recording had been automatically appended, only a few seconds long. It showed the parking lot, my car pulling away, and behind it, far in the distance but unmistakable, a fourth person, standing on the ridge, watching, always watching, and the timestamp proved it. They filmed it from my stolen camera before placing it on the slab, meaning someone else had been there, meaning I hadn't seen all of them, meaning the hollow hadn't just been watching me, it had been following me, and I still don't know how many people were actually there that day, or how many of them found their way out.